In the quiet hills of upstate New York, a young man claimed he had seen the divine, a vision that he said would change the world, bringing ancient truths back to light. But Joseph Smith's journey was no simple calling. It's a tale of revelations, ambition, and controversy that ignited one of history's most enduring religious movements. How did this farm boy rise to the heights of spiritual power? And what truths and secrets lie behind his legacy? The early 19th century was a time of spiritual upheaval in the United States. The Second Great Awakening swept across the land, inspiring fiery sermons, dramatic conversions, and relentless quests for divine truth. In this atmosphere of revival and reform, the Smith family eked out a living in rural New York, a region buzzing with folk traditions, buried treasures, and apocalyptic expectations. Amid these influences, young Joseph Smith emerged as a figure unlike any other. His youth was steeped in tales of treasure hunting, mysterious stones, and visions of celestial messengers. By his own account, it was these divine encounters that would set him apart and lead to the creation of a faith that still shapes millions of lives today. The early 19th century was a time of extraordinary spiritual upheaval in the United States. Known as the Second Great Awakening, it was a period of passionate revivals, fervent sermons, and new religious movements springing to life. Amidst this environment, the Smith family struggled to make a living, moving frequently due to financial hardships and the failed ventures of Joseph Smith Sr., the family patriarch. Their home region of upstate New York, later dubbed the Burned-Over District, became a hotbed of religious experimentation. It was here that ordinary people claimed extraordinary experiences, visions, divine revelations, and encounters with the spiritual world. These claims were not isolated. In 1815, Norris Stearns published an account of his vision in Greenfield, Massachusetts. He described seeing two spirits, which he identified as God and Jesus, saying, "At length, being in an ecstasy of joy, I turned to the other side of the bed. There I saw two spirits, which I knew at the first sight. One was God, my Maker, almost in bodily shape like a man. Below him stood Jesus Christ, my Redeemer, in perfect shape like a man." This account, widely circulated, reached audiences across New England and New York, including areas frequented by the Smith family. Asa Wilde, in 1823, reported hearing the voice of God proclaiming that all churches had become corrupt. Solomon Chamberlain, in 1816, shared a vision of an angel who revealed that God would soon raise up a new church. These stories weren't just personal accounts, they were cultural artifacts shaping a world ready to accept the supernatural. In the early 19th century, Joseph Smith was immersed in a world rich with literature that blended history, adventure, and moral lessons. One of the notable works circulating at the time was the first Book of Napoleon, published in 1809. Written in a pseudo-biblical style, it presents the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte with moralistic undertones, opening with the passage,
"And behold, it came to pass in these latter days that an evil spirit arose on the face of the earth."
Another widely read book was The Late War Between the United States and Great Britain, published in 1816. This work recounts the events of the War of 1812, also using scriptural language. It begins,
"Now it came to pass, in the second year of the reign of Madison, that the people of Columbia were still engaged in war."
By framing historical events in a biblical tone, the authors offered readers a sense of divine narrative within contemporary history. Beyond these historical and moralistic narratives, tales of piracy and hidden treasures captivated the imaginations of many. The exploits of Captain William Kidd, a notorious pirate, were particularly popular, even among school children. Legends spoke of Kidd's buried treasures, guarded by spirits, awaiting discovery by those with the courage and knowledge to seek them. These stories often featured exotic locales, including references to the Comoros Islands off the eastern coast of Africa. Interestingly, the capital city of this archipelago is Moroni, a name that would later emerge in Joseph's narratives. In the early 1820s, upstate New York was a land of religious fervor, but it was also steeped in folk traditions and supernatural beliefs. Many people believed in hidden treasures left behind by ancient civilizations, often said to be guarded by spirits. Treasure seekers, known as money diggers, used divining rods, incantations, and seer stones to locate these riches, while rituals and magic circles were thought to break curses protecting them. Joseph Smith, like his father, became involved in this culture. He claimed to possess a special stone, his peep stone, that allowed him to see buried treasures beneath the earth. Stories spread that he could peer into his hat, where he placed the stone, and discern the location of lost riches. One of the men who heard of Joseph's abilities was Josiah Stowell, a wealthy landowner from Bainbridge, New York. Stowell had spent years searching for a fabled Spanish silver mine rumored to be buried near Harmony, Pennsylvania. In 1825, he hired Joseph to help locate it, believing that his gift as a seer could lead them to fortune. Joseph traveled to Harmony and joined the expedition, leading Stowell and others on numerous digs. Despite their efforts, no treasure was ever found. But while the expedition proved fruitless, Joseph's time in Harmony led him to something far more significant: Emma Hale. While assisting Stowell, Joseph boarded at the home of Isaac Hale, a well-respected landowner in Harmony. It was there that he met Emma Hale, Isaac's intelligent and devout daughter. Unlike the rough company Joseph often kept, Emma was well-educated and came from a family of strong Christian values. The two quickly developed a deep connection, but their relationship was met with resistance. Isaac Hale saw Joseph as an unsuitable match for his daughter. He was unimpressed with Joseph's reputation as a money digger and found his claims of supernatural abilities suspect. To Isaac, Joseph was a drifter, an unreliable young man with no stable profession, making grand claims to deceive the gullible. Despite this, Joseph and Emma's relationship continued in secret. Joseph's treasure-seeking ventures did not go unnoticed. In 1826, he was brought before a court in Bainbridge, New York, on charges of disorderly conduct related to his treasure digging. Witnesses, including Josiah Stowell, were called to testify. Stowell still believed in Joseph's abilities and defended him in court, but others, including Stowell's nephews, were determined to expose Joseph as a fraud. According to the surviving court records, Joseph admitted that he had used his peepstone to look for treasure, but claimed he had since abandoned the practice. Whether he was convicted remains debated. Some records suggest he was found guilty and fined, while others indicate he was let off with a warning. Regardless, the trial marked an early public challenge to Joseph's credibility. While some dismissed him as a charlatan, others continued to believe in his gifts. This would not be the last time Joseph would find himself navigating the fine line between faith and deception. Though Joseph Smith's reputation had been built on treasure digging, his claims were about to take a dramatic turn. What had once been framed as a search for earthly riches would now become something far more profound: a divine mission. In the fall of 1823, long before his marriage to Emma, Joseph claimed that he had been visited by a heavenly messenger. In the dead of night, an angel named Moroni allegedly appeared by his bedside and spoke of an ancient record engraved on golden plates. These plates, Moroni explained, contained the sacred history of a vanished civilization, one that had once inhabited the Americas and had been guided by Jesus Christ himself. According to Joseph, the angel revealed that the plates were buried in a nearby hill, but could only be retrieved when the time was right. Over the next 4 years, Joseph claimed that he returned to the hill annually, receiving further instruction from Moroni and preparing for the great responsibility ahead. It was no coincidence that these annual visits took place on the autumnal equinox, a date deeply tied to folk magic traditions. Whether by divine command or mystical influence, Joseph's story had now shifted from treasure hunting to prophecy. But when the time finally came to retrieve the plates, Joseph faced an even greater challenge, convincing others to believe him. By 1827, Joseph was no longer just a young seer with a peepstone. He was now claiming to be the chosen instrument of God's will. And yet, despite his growing confidence, his greatest skeptic remained the same: Isaac Hale. After eloping with Emma, Joseph brought her to Manchester, where they lived briefly with his parents. But he knew that if he was to establish himself and fulfill his divine mission, he needed stability. Against all odds, he convinced Emma to return with him to Harmony. Begrudgingly, Isaac Hale allowed them to stay on his property, but his patience wore thin when Joseph announced that he was now in possession of the golden plates. Isaac demanded to see them. He wanted proof that his son-in-law's outlandish claims were more than just an elaborate deception. But as before, Joseph refused, saying the plates were divinely protected and that no unauthorized person could view them. To Isaac, this was confirmation of his worst fears. His daughter had married a fraud. Though Isaac never believed in Joseph, Emma did. And it was Emma, not any of the male witnesses who would later swear to the plate's existence, who was there from the very beginning. She became Joseph's first scribe, writing down his dictated words as he began what he claimed was the inspired translation of an ancient record. While others doubted, she remained by his side, helping to lay the foundation for the movement that would soon sweep across the nation. Joseph Smith's early years were marked by contradiction. He was a treasure digger who never found treasure, a seer who faced public skepticism, and a husband who won the heart of a woman against her family's will. His life was already a complex web of belief, ambition, and controversy. But this was only the beginning. With Emma by his side and his claims of divine revelation growing, Joseph's path would soon shift from treasure hunting to prophecy, from fraud accusations to religious leadership. But as his following grew, so too did the challenges that would test his marriage, his faith, and his ability to convince the world that he was truly called by God. Would his rise be one of divine destiny, or would his past continue to haunt him? After retrieving the golden plates in 1827, Joseph claimed that he had also been given a sacred tool to aid in their translation, an ancient set of seer stones mounted in silver bows, which he called the Urim and Thummim. According to Joseph, these instruments, resembling large spectacles, were prepared by God to help him decipher the ancient record. This divine tool reinforced the sacred nature of the translation and set it apart from his earlier treasure-seeking practices. By 1828, Joseph had few followers, but one stood out as both a devout supporter and a much-needed financial backer: Martin Harris. A prosperous farmer from Palmyra, Harris was drawn to Joseph's claims and eager to see the work completed. More than that, he was willing to put his money behind it. He mortgaged his farm to help fund the translation of the plates, an act that would later strain his marriage and financial security. But Harris wanted more than just faith. He wanted proof. Repeatedly, he asked Joseph to let him see the plates. But just as Joseph had denied Isaac Hale's requests, he denied Harris as well. Still, Harris remained committed to the project, volunteering to act as scribe as Joseph dictated the translation. As Joseph continued his work, Harris faced increasing pressure from his skeptical wife, Lucy Harris. She was deeply suspicious of Joseph and feared her husband was being manipulated. Determined to prove her wrong, and perhaps to reassure himself, Harris made a request that would change the course of the project. He wanted to take the manuscript home and show it to his wife and a few select individuals. Joseph hesitated. He claimed that God had denied the request, but after repeated pleading, he prayed again. This time, a revelation permitted Harris to take the manuscript, on the condition that he show it only to those whom Joseph had approved. With the first 116 pages of the Book of Mormon in his hands, Harris left for Palmyra, unaware that disaster was about to strike. Days turned into weeks, and Harris remained silent. Anxious and fearing the worst, Joseph made the journey to Palmyra to find out what had happened. When he arrived, he found Harris in despair. He had lost the manuscript. Whether it was stolen, destroyed, or hidden by Lucy Harris remains a mystery to this day. What is certain is that the only copy of the first portion of the Book of Mormon had vanished. Joseph was devastated. If this record was sacred scripture, why had God allowed it to be lost? If it was truly a divinely inspired text, could he not simply retranslate it? These were the very questions his critics would soon ask. The loss of the manuscript was a crisis unlike anything Joseph had faced before. His credibility was at stake. His critics were emboldened. How could a prophet entrusted with God's words be so careless? And what would stop someone from producing the missing pages and exposing inconsistencies if Joseph attempted to rewrite them? But Joseph did not attempt to retranslate the text. Instead, he later claimed that God had foreseen this event and had prepared an alternative record, the small plates of Nephi. This new revelation explained that the original manuscript was never meant to be included in the final Book of Mormon. Instead, God had provided a separate record containing the same spiritual truths, but with a different focus. Joseph framed the loss as a divine test, one that he had now passed. Rather than being a failure, it was proof of God's greater plan. For Joseph, this was a turning point. He had learned a hard lesson about trust, secrecy, and the weight of his prophetic role. He would never again allow someone outside his immediate inner circle to take possession of his work. The translation would continue, but from this point forward, it would be under even stricter control. The loss of the 116 pages marked the first major crisis in Joseph Smith's prophetic career. It was a moment where faith collided with skepticism, where divine authority was challenged by human error. But rather than abandon his mission, Joseph reframed the disaster as part of God's greater plan. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout his life. Every challenge, every controversy, every setback would not be a failure, but a lesson, a trial to be overcome. But if the loss of the pages was a test, the real challenge was still to come. The Book of Mormon was yet to be completed, and Joseph's claims would soon demand more than just faith. They would require witnesses, testimony, and an unwavering belief in the unseen. With the loss of the 116 pages behind him, Joseph Smith faced a defining moment. He had claimed that God had provided an alternative record, the small plates of Nephi, to replace the missing text. But now, he had to complete the translation under stricter conditions. There could be no more mistakes, no more misplaced trust, no more risks that would jeopardize the divine work. This time, he needed someone new to assist him. And that's when Oliver Cowdery entered the picture. Before Oliver Cowdery arrived in Harmony to assist Joseph Smith, his path had already led him through a world of religious speculation and grand historical narratives. In Poultney, Vermont, Cowdery was connected to the congregation of Ethan Smith, a minister who, in 1823, had published a book that sought to uncover the ancient past of the Americas, View of the Hebrews. Ethan Smith's work presented a bold claim that the Native Americans were the scattered remnants of the lost tribes of Israel, fulfilling prophecies that had been spoken of in ancient days. According to View of the Hebrews, the Lord had once brought a remnant of his people to a distant land, but because of their iniquities, they fell into darkness and were smitten by the judgments of God. In one passage, Ethan Smith wrote,
"And it came to pass that the people of the Lord, being led by his hand, did journey forth into a far country, across the great waters, that they might inherit a land of promise. But they did wax strong in their own might, and they did forget the Lord their God. And thus were they smitten and scattered upon the face of the land."
Another passage speaks of sacred records, hidden in the earth for a future generation.
And behold, a record shall come forth from the dust, yea, even out of the ground shall it speak, and it shall whisper out of the dust, that the seed of Jacob may know of the covenants of the Lord.
It described the destruction of a once great civilization.
And their mighty cities were laid waste, and their strongholds did crumble before the hand of the Lord, insomuch that the people were smitten with sore affliction, and they who remained did fall into unbelief, and did wander upon the face of the land.
These words were not just speculation. To many, they were prophecy. Few of the Hebrews argued that sacred records of these ancient Israelites would one day come forth, testifying of their lost history and restoring their knowledge of the Lord. Cowdery lived among those who believed these ideas, who preached them in sermons, and who saw America as a land of divine destiny. His connection to Ethan Smith and view of the Hebrews raises intriguing questions. Had he already encountered a narrative of a lost Israelite civilization in America before ever meeting Joseph Smith? And when he arrived in Harmony, eager to assist in the translation, did he unknowingly bring with him a framework that would help shape the Book of Mormon into what it would become? What is certain is that shortly after Cowdery's arrival, the work took on renewed focus. He became Joseph's chief scribe, recording the words as they were dictated. His presence marked a turning point, not just in finishing the translation, but perhaps in refining the vision itself. When Oliver Cowdery took over as scribe, the translation of the Book of Mormon resumed with a renewed sense of urgency. But there was a notable shift in the method. Although Joseph had initially claimed to use the Urim and Thummim, the divinely prepared spectacles, he soon abandoned them, instead returning to the same method he had used in his treasure-seeking days. Instead of reading from the plates, Joseph placed his small brown seer stone into a hat, buried his face inside, and dictated the words as they appeared before him. The golden plates were often not present in the room at all. This change in translation technique raised significant questions, even among some of his followers. If God had provided an instrument for translation, why had Joseph reverted to the very same method he had used when searching for buried treasure? To his supporters, it didn't matter. The words he dictated were what truly mattered. But to his critics, it was an unmistakable link between his past and present, a sign that the Book of Mormon's origins might not be as divine as he claimed. As the translation continued, another problem emerged: money. Publishing a book of this scale required significant resources, and Joseph had no financial means of his own. Once again, he turned to Martin Harris, the man who had already sacrificed so much for the project. Despite losing the 116 pages, Harris remained committed. He believed that God had called him to assist in bringing forth the record. And according to Harris, he received a revelation commanding him to not covet his own property and to give freely to the cause. Taking this as divine instruction, he mortgaged his farm to finance the publication of the Book of Mormon, a decision that would later lead to financial ruin and strain his marriage. But as Harris made this sacrifice, Joseph and his followers saw an opportunity to turn the sacred record into something even more valuable, leading them to one of the most controversial revelations yet. In 1829, Joseph Smith claimed to receive a revelation instructing Oliver Cowdery and others to sell the copyright of the Book of Mormon in Canada. The idea was simple. If they could secure publishing rights in Canada, they could generate the funds needed to print the book in America. Believing this to be a divine command, Cowdery and his associates set out on their journey, convinced that success was guaranteed. But when they arrived, they found no interest. No publisher was willing to purchase the rights to a book that had yet to be published. The revelation, which had come directly from God according to Joseph, had led them to failure. Some later accounts claim that Joseph admitted, "Some revelations are of God, some are of men, and some are of the devil." Whether he actually said this remains debated, but for his followers, the failure was troubling. For those who had given everything to support Joseph's mission, This explanation raised troubling questions. If this revelation had failed, what did that mean for the others? Despite the setbacks, Joseph pressed forward. By mid-1829, the translation of the Book of Mormon was nearing completion, but he faced a growing challenge, convincing the world that his record was real. He had refused to show the plates to Isaac Hale, to Martin Harris, and to countless others. But now, the time had come for others to bear witness. In June 1829, Joseph declared that God had revealed that there would be 3 witnesses to the plates. The men chosen were Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, and David Whitmer. Together they accompanied Joseph into the woods, knelt in prayer, and according to their testimony, an angel appeared before them, holding the golden plates. They reported that they saw the engravings, heard the voice of God declare them to be true, and were left with no doubt of their authenticity. But what exactly did they see? While early church members believed the 3 witnesses had physically seen the plates, later statements from the witnesses themselves suggest otherwise. Martin Harris would later explain that they saw the plates with the eyes of faith. David Whitmer similarly stated that they saw the plates by the power of God and that they were covered by a supernatural power. None of them ever explicitly claimed that they held or handled the plates in a physical sense. For critics, this raised serious questions. If the plates were real, why were they only shown in a vision? Why was no neutral observer ever allowed to inspect them? To believers, however, this was not an issue. Visions, after all, were part of God's way of revealing truth. And for Joseph, the testimony of the 3 witnesses was exactly what he needed to move forward. Shortly after the testimony of the 3 witnesses, Joseph arranged for another group to see the plates, the 8 witnesses, composed primarily of members of the Whitmer and Smith families. Unlike the first group, whose experience was clearly visionary, the testimony of the 8 witnesses suggested that they physically handled the plates, turned their pages, and examined the engravings. But did they? For years, the official story remained that the 8 witnesses saw the plates with their natural eyes. But as time passed, cracks began to form in this narrative. John Whitmer, one of the 8, was later asked if he had seen the plates in a literal sense. His answer, "I saw them with a spiritual eye." William Smith, Joseph's brother, later indicated that the plates were revealed in a supernatural setting, not an ordinary physical one. Even Martin Harris, though not one of the 8, suggested that their experience was spiritual rather than tangible. This distinction mattered. If the witnesses had truly seen and handled the plates in the same way one would inspect an ordinary book, it would have provided undeniable proof of their existence. But if their testimony was based on faith and spiritual experience rather than physical evidence, then the golden plates remained elusive, real only to those who believed. And yet, for Joseph Smith and his followers, this was enough. The testimonies of the 3 and 8 witnesses became foundational claims of the movement, printed in every edition of the Book of Mormon. For the faithful, these witnesses stood as undeniable proof. For skeptics, they were nothing more than men convinced of what they wanted to see. With the translation complete and the testimonies recorded, there was only one step left, publishing the Book of Mormon. But the task would not be easy. The cost was high, the opposition was fierce, and the path ahead would demand more than just faith. It would require perseverance, sacrifice, and the unwavering belief that this was God's will. Would the world accept the book as sacred scripture, or would Joseph's past continue to cast doubt over his mission? In 1829, Joseph Smith and Martin Harris traveled to Palmyra in search of a printer willing to publish the Book of Mormon. It was no small request. The book was nearly 600 pages long, and printing such a work would be extremely costly. The first printer they approached, Egbert B. Grandin, outright refused. He had heard of Joseph's claims and wanted nothing to do with the project. Undeterred, Joseph and Harris approached other printers in nearby towns, including Elihu F. Marshall in Rochester, New York. Marshall expressed interest, but the cost remained an obstacle. After several failed negotiations, they returned to Grandin, who finally agreed, but only on one condition. Joseph had to pay up front for the entire print run. The price was staggering, $3,000 for 5,000 copies. Adjusted for today, that would be well over $100,000. It was a sum Joseph simply did not have. And so, once again, he turned to his most loyal supporter, Martin Harris. Martin Harris had already mortgaged his farm once before to support the translation, and now he was being asked to do it again. But this time, the stakes were even higher. If the book failed to sell, he wouldn't just lose money, he would lose everything. His land, his livelihood, and his reputation in the community were all on the line. Harris wrestled with the decision, torn between his faith in Joseph's work and the very real possibility of financial ruin. According to some accounts, he sought divine confirmation one last time, praying to know if the book was truly from God. Whatever his reasoning, he ultimately agreed to sign over part of his farm as collateral, ensuring that the printing could go forward. As news spread that the Book of Mormon was going to press, opposition quickly mounted. Many in Palmyra viewed Joseph as a fraud, and the idea that a golden Bible was about to be published stirred anger and mockery. Religious leaders and prominent townspeople, including local ministers, tried to convince Grandin to abandon the project. They warned him that associating with Joseph would ruin his business, and that no one in Palmyra wanted the book printed. Sensing the controversy, Grandin hesitated, but by then, the deal was already made. The money had been secured, and the printing was set to begin. If Joseph's opponents wanted to stop the book, they would have to do more than just protest. Meanwhile, Martin Harris faced relentless ridicule. His wife, Lucy Harris, had already opposed his involvement, and now she was furious that he had risked their farm for what she saw as a foolish cause. His neighbors mocked him, his friends urged him to reconsider, and even those within Joseph's circle worried about what would happen if the book failed. But Harris was committed. He had given everything to see the work completed. With the funds secured, Grandin's printing office on Main Street in Palmyra began the monumental task of typesetting and printing the Book of Mormon. The work was done manually, one page at a time, letter by letter. The typesetters, many of whom were skeptical or outright hostile to Joseph's claims, often ridiculed the book as they worked. To speed up production, Grandin hired additional workers, but the process was still slow. The pages were printed on a hand-cranked press, and after each batch was completed, they had to be dried, folded, and bound. As the printing dragged on, opposition in the community grew stronger. Some of Joseph's critics even tried to buy up copies before they could be released, not to read them, but to destroy them. Others attempted to pressure Grandin into stopping the process altogether, but the work continued. After months of painstaking labor, the first copies of the Book of Mormon were completed in March 1830. 5,000 copies had been printed, an astonishing number for a book from an unknown author. But now came the real challenge. Publishing the book was one thing. Getting people to read it was another. With tensions in Palmyra rising and sales uncertain, the very future of Joseph Smith's movement depended on what happened next. Would the Book of Mormon find an audience, or would it fade into obscurity? Would Martin Harris see a return on his immense financial sacrifice, or had he thrown his life away on a deception? And most importantly, was this book truly the Word of God, or was it merely the product of Joseph Smith's imagination? For Joseph, the time had come to find out. With the Book of Mormon finally in print, Joseph Smith's mission had entered a new phase. He was no longer just a translator, he was now the leader of a new religious movement. But organizing a church meant more than just gathering followers. It meant structure, governance, and facing the inevitable backlash from a world that was not ready to accept his revelations. Would people believe in this new church? Could it survive in the face of ridicule and rejection? And most importantly, was Joseph prepared to lead it? On April 6, 1830, a small group of believers gathered at the home of Peter Whitmer Sr. in Fayette, New York. The event was modest, just 6 men, the number legally required in New York to establish a religious society. Among them were Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, Samuel Smith, Hiram Smith, David Whitmer, and Peter Whitmer Jr. Together, they formally organized the Church of Christ, took the sacrament, and performed baptisms. Joseph was recognized as the church's leader and designated first elder, with Oliver Cowdery as second elder. It was a simple beginning, but the declaration was profound. This was not just another Christian sect, it was a restoration of Christ's original church. Though only 6 men signed as founding members, others had already accepted the Book of Mormon's message. Joseph's mother, Lucy Mack Smith, and several Whitmer family members were among the first to be baptized. Joseph's younger brother, Samuel Smith, soon became the first missionary, taking copies of the Book of Mormon and preaching its message. One of these copies made its way into the hands of Phineas Young, the brother of a man who would later become one of the most significant figures in Mormon history, Brigham Young. Meanwhile, others intrigued by the new faith, including Parley P. Pratt, would soon join the movement and play a key role in its expansion. But as the church began growing, not everyone welcomed its presence. News of the new church spread quickly. The idea of a new Bible and a restored Church of Christ sparked intense reactions. Some were curious, but many saw Joseph Smith as a fraud. Local ministers warned their congregations against reading the Book of Mormon, dismissing it as deception. Others ridiculed the idea that an angel had visited Joseph, or that golden plates had ever existed. To them, this was either a clever scam or the delusions of an unstable mind. More concerning was the fact that people were leaving their churches to follow Joseph's teachings. This was not just about doctrine, it was about power. Ministers saw the church as a direct challenge to their authority, and their opposition soon became organized. Despite the growing hostility, Joseph and his followers pressed forward. By June 1830, they held their first conference in Fayette, New York. The movement was gaining momentum, and Joseph's role as its leader was becoming clearer. Up until this point, Joseph Smith had primarily been known as the translator of the Book of Mormon. But now, his role was evolving. He was no longer just the man who had brought forth an ancient record. He was now seen as God's chosen prophet. New revelations followed, dictating how the church should be governed, how its members should live, and what the future held for those who accepted its message. But leadership came with risks. Joseph's authority would be challenged, his revelations questioned, and his movement tested. He had organized a church, but now he had to fight for its survival. The real test was about to begin. As the church grew, so did the opposition. From the moment Joseph Smith declared himself a prophet, he faced fierce resistance, not just from religious leaders, but from entire communities who saw his movement as a threat. And in the months following the church's organization, that resistance became personal. In the summer of 1830, Joseph was arrested and brought to trial in South Bainbridge, New York, charged with being a disorderly person, a vague legal term often used against fraudsters and vagrants. The court case wasn't about theology. It was about whether Joseph had been deceiving people for money. Some testified in his defense, claiming he was a man of God. Others insisted he was a charlatan. Ultimately, he was acquitted, but this was only the beginning. Over the next several years, Joseph would face more arrests, each one fueled by growing opposition to his claims. But legal trouble was just one of the challenges ahead. Hostility toward the church was spreading, and soon it would escalate beyond the courtroom. Legal battles were one thing, physical violence was another. The idea of a new Bible, a self-proclaimed prophet, and a restored Church of Christ was seen as dangerous by many. Ministers warned their congregations to stay away from this false prophet. Families disowned members who joined the movement, and rumors spread that Joseph was misleading people for personal gain. In some towns, this opposition turned violent. Joseph and other church members were harassed, threatened, and in some cases, attacked. In one of the most brutal incidents, he was tarred and feathered, a form of mob violence meant to publicly humiliate him. But despite the backlash, Joseph pressed forward. And in 1832, he wrote something that would later become one of the most important pieces of his prophetic story, his first recorded vision. In 1832, Joseph Smith wrote for the first time about a vision he had experienced years earlier. In this account, he described how as a young man in his 16th year, he had been deeply troubled by the state of Christianity. But unlike later versions of the story, he did not go into the woods to ask which church was true. He already believed that all churches were corrupt before he even prayed. According to his own words, "I found that mankind had departed from the true and living faith, and there was no society or denomination that was built upon the gospel of Jesus Christ." Joseph said that when he finally prayed for forgiveness of his sins, he was visited by a divine being, who he referred to as the Lord. The heavenly being assured him that his sins were forgiven. This early account of his vision was not widely shared at the time, nor was it included in church teachings. It remained a private record, a glimpse into the evolving nature of his theology and divine experiences. But as Joseph continued to lead the church, revelations like this would play an increasingly important role in shaping his prophetic identity. By the end of 1832, the church was growing, but so was the opposition. New York was no longer a safe place to build Zion. The saints needed a new home, a gathering place where they could grow as a people. And so, in 1831, Joseph declared that it was time to leave New York behind. God, he said, had revealed a new land of promise, the destination, Ohio. In December 1830, Joseph Smith declared that God had revealed a new commandment. The saints were to leave New York and gather in Ohio. Kirtland, he said, would be a temporary place of refuge where the saints could strengthen their community before moving westward to Zion. But this was more than just a practical move. Ohio was already home to a growing group of converts, thanks to the efforts of early missionaries. Among the most important was Sidney Rigdon, a former Baptist preacher whose congregation had been primed for a restored gospel. When Rigdon and his followers read the Book of Mormon, many of them accepted it, and with over 100 new believers already waiting in Kirtland, Ohio was the logical place to establish the church's first headquarters. By early 1831, Joseph and dozens of other saints packed up their belongings and set out for their new promised land. Kirtland quickly became the center of Mormon life. Converts poured in, the church grew, and Joseph's leadership expanded. This was not just a religious movement, it was the foundation of a new society. But growth required structure. To unify the saints, Joseph introduced new commandments, new leadership roles, and a radical idea, the law of consecration. The law of consecration was one of Joseph's most ambitious revelations. It commanded church members to give all of their property and wealth to the church, which would then distribute resources according to need. Edward Partridge, one of the early converts from Kirtland, was appointed as the church's first bishop and tasked with overseeing this economic system. The idea was to create a self-sufficient cooperative society free from greed and poverty. But the system quickly faced challenges. Some members resisted turning over their property, while others struggled to adjust to communal living. Managing resources fairly proved difficult, and the system eventually collapsed, giving way to a more traditional economic structure. Despite its failure, the law of consecration represented Joseph's vision for the church, not just a place of worship, but a divinely directed society unlike anything else in America at the time. As the church grew, so did Joseph's influence. New revelations expanded his role from prophet to lawgiver, judge, and political leader. He established church councils, declared new doctrines, and positioned himself at the center of every decision. For believers, this was evidence that God was guiding the movement. But for outsiders, it was alarming. Joseph was no longer just a preacher. He was becoming something much bigger, and to many, much more dangerous. In early 1832, opposition in Ohio reached a breaking point. That March, Joseph and Sidney Rigdon were staying at the John Johnson home in Hiram, Ohio, about 30 miles south of Kirtland. Joseph had been working on his translation of the Bible and continuing to guide the church. But resentment against him had been building. The church's rapid growth had unsettled local communities, and former members, such as Simon's Ryder, felt betrayed by Joseph's leadership. But beyond these frustrations, there were whispers of something more scandalous, accusations of inappropriate relations between Joseph and a teenage girl, Nancy Marinda Johnson. That accusation, combined with the larger resentment against the church, led a mob of around 25 men to take action. Late at night, they stormed the Johnson home, dragged Joseph from his bed, and took him outside in the freezing March air. There, they brutally attacked him, beating him, stripping his clothes, and covering his body in hot tar and feathers. Some reports suggest that the mob attempted to castrate him, believing that he had taken advantage of young women in the community. Others claim they tried to force poison into his mouth, burning his throat. After the attack, Joseph lay in agony through the night, the tar burning his skin. The next morning, still covered in the remnants of the assault, he stood before a congregation and preached. For Joseph's followers, this was proof of his divine calling. If he were a fraud, why would he endure such suffering for his message? If he were just another preacher, why did so many fear him? For his enemies, the attack had not gone far enough. Though they had humiliated him, Joseph was not silenced. He would not stop preaching. He would not abandon his mission. And in the years to come, violence against the saints would only escalate. By 1832, it was clear Kirtland was not the final gathering place for the saints. Despite its success, Ohio was still a temporary refuge. Joseph had already prophesied of a greater land, a place where the saints would build Zion, the New Jerusalem. And now, it was time to find it. Joseph declared that God had revealed where Zion would be built. In July 1831, Joseph Smith announced that God had revealed the location of Zion, the city of God. The revelation, recorded as Doctrine and Covenants 57, identified Independence, Missouri, as the central gathering place where the saints would build the New Jerusalem. This was not just a practical relocation. It was a divine command. Joseph declared that this land had been foreordained as the place where Christ would return. And he urged his followers to gather in Missouri and prepare for the second coming. But there was a problem. The land was already occupied. Missouri was still a wild frontier, home to both settlers and Native American tribes. The region had been designated as Indian Territory, and many white Missourians saw it as a place to start fresh, away from the structured cities of the East. When the first groups of saints arrived, tensions quickly emerged. The locals viewed the newcomers with suspicion. The Mormons were different. They were clannish, religiously zealous, and most alarmingly, they believed Missouri was theirs by divine right. Joseph and his followers began purchasing land in Independence, establishing settlements, and declaring that they were preparing the way for Christ's return. This aggressive expansion did not go unnoticed by the non-Mormon settlers. Despite resistance, the saints pushed forward. Joseph sent missionaries to Native American tribes, believing that they were the Lamanites from the Book of Mormon, and that they would soon convert and join the saints in building Zion. This was a radical idea. Most settlers saw the Native Americans as a threat, but Joseph believed they were part of God's plan. The church also established printing operations, opened schools, and laid the groundwork for what they believed would be a holy city. At the center of it all, Joseph declared, would be a grand temple, a symbol of the final gathering before Christ's return. But the saints' confidence and their rapid expansion only deepened the divide between them and the Missourians. To the non-Mormon settlers, the saints weren't just another group of religious migrants. They were a threat to their way of life. Joseph and his followers openly declared that Missouri was their promised land, and they were not shy about saying that God would eventually give it to them. This rhetoric, combined with their increasing numbers, alarmed local residents. By 1832, tensions had reached a boiling point. The saints voted as a bloc, which made them a political threat. They openly preached that Missouri would belong to them. They worked closely with Native Americans, which many settlers saw as dangerous. And then there was the issue of slavery. Missouri was a slave state, and most of its settlers supported slavery. But the saints, many of whom came from the free states of the North, were deeply divided on the issue. Joseph Smith himself had not yet taken a firm stance, but many early Mormon converts opposed slavery, something that made the locals uneasy. They feared that the growing Mormon population would shift the political balance of the region and push Missouri toward abolition. This, combined with existing tensions, made conflict inevitable. By late 1832, rumors and threats turned into action. Mobs began forming, warning the saints to leave. Homes were vandalized, property was destroyed, and violence became a constant threat. The printing press where church materials were produced was smashed and burned by an angry mob. In July 1833, tensions erupted into open conflict. A group of Missourians issued an ultimatum. The Mormons had to leave, or they would be forced out. When the saints refused, the mobs attacked. Homes were set on fire, crops were destroyed, and several church members were brutally beaten. Joseph himself was not in Missouri at the time, but he received reports of the violence and knew that the saints were in grave danger. He urged them to stand firm, but the situation was spiraling out of control. By the end of 1833, the saints had lost their first battle in Missouri. Forced from their homes, they fled Jackson County, scattering into surrounding areas. Many sought refuge in Clay County, where they hoped to regroup and rebuild. But this was only the beginning of their struggles in Missouri. Joseph, now realizing that violence would be a constant threat, began organizing the saints not just spiritually, but militarily. He declared that they had the right to defend themselves, and that Zion would not be lost so easily. And in the years to come, that conflict would escalate into full-blown war. While the saints in Missouri were struggling for survival, Joseph Smith was expanding his vision in Kirtland. This was no longer just about gathering followers. It was about building a new kind of society, one structured by divine law and sacred rituals. In December 1832, Joseph Smith recorded a revelation stating that the saints were to build a house of the Lord in Kirtland. This revelation, now known as Doctrine and Covenants 88, commanded the construction of a temple, a sacred space that would serve as a school of learning, a place of worship, and a site for divine revelations. For the early saints, the idea of building a temple was radical. Unlike traditional churches, a temple was considered a holy sanctuary where only the faithful could enter. It symbolized not just devotion, but power, God's power, channeled through Joseph Smith. In June 1833, the official plans for the Kirtland Temple were revealed. The saints were instructed to donate labor, money, and materials to complete it. But constructing a temple was an enormous undertaking for a poor and persecuted people. Despite the challenges, Joseph assured them that if they built the temple, they would receive divine blessings and knowledge unlike anything before. And with that promise, the saints poured their efforts into the grand project. As construction on the temple began, Joseph introduced new teachings that expanded his authority and the structure of the church. In 1833, he founded the School of the Prophets, a small gathering of church leaders dedicated to studying scripture, theology, and divine revelation. But beyond education, this was also where Joseph formalized the structure of church leadership, laying the foundation for what would later become the LDS priesthood hierarchy. For Joseph Smith, priesthood wasn't just leadership, it was divine power. He taught that the priesthood was the literal authority of God, a power that had existed in ancient times but had been lost after the apostles were killed. Now, in the latter days, that power had been restored through Joseph himself. But priesthood in Mormonism wasn't just one thing. It was divided into two levels. The Aaronic priesthood, named after Aaron, the brother of Moses. This was considered the lesser priesthood, focused on preparing individuals for higher responsibilities. The Melchizedek priesthood, named after Melchizedek, a mysterious high priest mentioned in the Bible. This was the higher priesthood, granting full spiritual authority. But where had this authority come from? At the time of the School of the Prophets, this question had not been publicly answered. It was only later, in 1834 to 1835, that Joseph introduced a new revelation, one that backdated the restoration of the priesthood to 1829. In 1834, 5 years after he claimed to have received the golden plates, Joseph revealed a new critical part of his prophetic calling, the restoration of the priesthood. According to this new account, in 1829, while translating the Book of Mormon, Joseph and Oliver Cowdery had asked God about baptism and spiritual authority. In response, John the Baptist himself appeared and conferred upon them the Aaronic priesthood. Shortly afterward, Joseph claimed, the ancient apostles Peter, James, and John appeared to them and restored the higher Melchizedek priesthood. But there was a problem. None of these events had been recorded before 1834. The Book of Mormon itself made no mention of priesthood authority being lost or needing restoration. Even early church publications from 1830 to 1833 did not teach this. So why did the story appear now? By 1834, the church was expanding rapidly, and Joseph needed to solidify his authority. Many early followers were questioning where his power to ordain leaders came from. The priesthood restoration story answered that question. It showed that Joseph was not just a prophet, but that he held the very keys of God's authority directly from heavenly messengers. For believers, this was confirmation that the church was divinely led. For skeptics, it was evidence that Joseph was rewriting history to justify his growing power. As the church's structure was evolving in 1834, its identity evolved as well. That year, the church's name was officially changed from the Church of Christ to the Church of the Latter-day Saints. Along with the priesthood restoration story, Joseph introduced new leadership roles that further structured the church. The first presidency was established, with Joseph as its head. High priests were appointed as elite spiritual leaders. The quorum of the 12 apostles was organized in 1835, modeled after Jesus' original disciples. With these new offices in place, the church now had a structured leadership model that centralized power under Joseph. This also meant that loyalty to Joseph became a matter of faith. To reject him was to reject God's restored authority on earth. During the early Kirtland years, Joseph produced multiple revelations. One of the most widely known revelations, and one that has set the church apart from other faiths over the years, actually started out as a suggestion, rather than a commandment. By early 1833, health and morality were hot topics in American religious life. the temperance movement was sweeping across the country, calling for moderation or total abstinence from alcohol and tobacco. On February 26, 1833, the United States held its National Day of Temperance, and the discussion reached even the small frontier town of Kirtland, Ohio. Among the saints, the issue hit particularly close to home. In the School of the Prophets, a small upper room where Joseph Smith and other church elders gathered to study and pray, it was common for the men to chew and smoke tobacco during their meetings. The air was thick with smoke, and the floor was often littered with spit. The task of cleaning this room often fell to Emma Smith, who was increasingly disturbed by the mess. According to later accounts, she lamented aloud that it would be a blessing if a revelation were given condemning the use of tobacco, both for its filth and its moral implications. That conversation apparently sparked some light-hearted banter among the brethren. One elder, perhaps in jest, suggested that if tobacco were going to be condemned, then tea and coffee, favorites of the women, should be too. To their surprise, the very next day, Joseph delivered a new revelation. It condemned strong drinks, warned against tobacco, and also instructed the saints to abstain from hot drinks, a phrase that early members universally understood to mean tea and coffee. This text would become known as the Word of Wisdom, now recorded as Doctrine and Covenants, section 89. The timing of the revelation, and its inclusion of both tobacco and hot drinks, has led some historians to suggest that it may have been influenced as much by domestic tensions and contemporary reform movements as by divine commandment. While the tea and coffee joke is not recorded in official documents, it appears in later second-hand accounts and biographies and reflects the very human dynamics at play in the early church. For believers, the Word of Wisdom was a testament to Joseph's prophetic insight. For others, it may have been a practical and even humorous response to the concerns of the day. But regardless of its origins, the revelation would go on to shape Mormon culture for generations, becoming one of the most distinctive features of Latter-day Saint life. At the same time Joseph was establishing the priesthood, his understanding of God was changing. Originally, early church teachings followed a traditional Christian belief that God and Jesus were the same being. The 1830 Book of Mormon even reflected this, saying that Jesus is the eternal Father. But by 1835, Joseph's doctrine had shifted. He now taught that God the Father and Jesus Christ were separate beings. To match this new theology, he changed the first vision story. In his 1832 written account, he had described seeing only one being, Jesus Christ. But in 1835, he revised the story to include two distinct beings, God the Father and Jesus Christ. He also updated the Book of Mormon in 1837, changing earlier verses that had implied God and Jesus were the same. This was a fundamental shift in Mormon theology, one that would set it apart from mainstream Christianity forever. In the summer of 1835, a traveling antiquities dealer named Michael Chandler arrived in Kirtland, Ohio, carrying a remarkable collection, several Egyptian mummies and rolls of ancient papyrus. At the time, Egyptology was still in its infancy. The Rosetta Stone had only been deciphered a few years earlier, and very few people in America had ever seen Egyptian writings. But Joseph Smith claimed to have an extraordinary ability, the power to translate ancient records. When he examined Chandler's papyri, he declared that they were no ordinary documents. They contained the lost writings of the biblical patriarch Abraham. Excited by this discovery, Joseph convinced church members to purchase the papyri and mummies for $2,400, a staggering sum for a struggling community. He immediately set to work, claiming to translate the ancient records through divine revelation. Unlike the golden plates, which had been taken away by an angel, these documents were physical artifacts, real papyrus scrolls that the saints could see and touch. This was proof, Joseph said, that the ancient world was testifying of the restored gospel. As Joseph worked on the translation, he also began developing something new. a grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, an attempt to create a system for understanding Egyptian script. To his followers, this was a profound breakthrough, a prophet unlocking the mysteries of an ancient civilization. But to later scholars, it would become one of the most controversial aspects of his prophetic career.
As early as 1835, rumors circulated that Joseph was privately teaching plural marriage, the idea that a man could have multiple wives as part of a divine commandment. At the same time, the church publicly denounced polygamy. That year, the church published a statement in its official Doctrine and Covenants stating, "We declare that one man should have one wife." But behind closed doors, something else was happening. Sometime between 1835 and 1836, Joseph is believed to have taken his first plural wife, Fanny Alger, a teenage girl who had been living with the Smith family as a house servant. Though details remain murky, multiple later accounts suggest that Joseph and Fanny were married in secret. Some claimed it was a legitimate union, sanctioned by God. Others, including Oliver Cowdery, saw it as an affair, a scandalous betrayal of Emma Smith, Joseph's first and legal wife. Whatever the truth, the fallout was immediate. Fanny Alger was quietly removed from the Smith household, and Emma, furious over the situation, forced her to leave town. This was the first documented case of Joseph engaging in plural marriage, a practice that would remain secret for years, but would eventually shake the church to its core. For now, the rumors faded, but they were not forgotten. And soon, the issue of polygamy would come back in a way that Joseph could no longer deny. Despite internal controversies, the saints pressed forward with the construction of the temple. After 3 years of labor and sacrifice, the Kirtland temple was complete. The dedication ceremony, held on March 27, 1836, was one of the most extraordinary spiritual events in early church history. Hundreds of saints gathered, packing the temple to capacity. Joseph Smith led the services, declaring that the building had been accepted by God. But according to reports, something much greater happened that day. Many saints later testified that they had witnessed divine manifestations. Some claimed to have seen angels standing on the temple roof. Others said they had heard the voice of God. Many reported experiencing visions, prophesying, and speaking in tongues. One of the most dramatic accounts came from Joseph Smith himself. He later recorded that Jesus Christ appeared to him and Oliver Cowdery in the temple, declaring that the church had been accepted by heaven. He also claimed that several biblical figures, Moses, Elias, and Elijah, appeared and gave him new divine keys. This was the crowning moment of the Kirtland period and the height of Joseph's power. But the triumph would be short-lived. Within a year, Kirtland would fall into financial ruin, internal dissent, and complete collapse. After the completion of the Kirtland temple, Joseph introduced a new and sacred experience, a special ritual that could only be done inside the Kirtland temple. He called it the endowment. Unlike regular church meetings, the endowment was a private ritual, available only to select church leaders. Participants were ritually washed and anointed with oil, a symbolic act meant to purify them and prepare them for divine knowledge. Some described the experience as overwhelming, as if they were stepping into a higher spiritual realm. Many reported speaking in tongues, prophesying, and even seeing visions of angels. This was unlike anything most converts had ever experienced. To Joseph and his followers, these rituals were a restoration of ancient priesthood ceremonies, proof that God was preparing the saints for Christ's return. But to outsiders, and even some within the church, the secrecy surrounding the rituals was unsettling, and soon doubts would arise not just about these new ceremonies, but about Joseph's prophetic claims themselves. Throughout the Kirtland period, Joseph made several bold predictions about the future, prophecies that many believed were inspired by God. But as time passed, some of those predictions failed to come true, leading to doubt, dissent, and open rebellion against his leadership. One of the most dramatic prophecies was that Jesus Christ would return within 56 years, before 1891. Joseph declared that he had received this revelation directly from God, and for the faithful, it was proof that the last days were approaching. But years later, when Christ did not return, many would question why this prophecy had failed. Another prophecy centered on Kirtland itself. Joseph assured the saints that Kirtland would remain the spiritual gathering place for the church, a holy city where the saints would prepare for the end times. Yet within a year, the saints would be forced to abandon it. And then there was Missouri, the land Joseph had proclaimed would become the center of Zion, the place where the righteous would gather before Christ's return. He had promised that the saints would establish a permanent settlement there, but instead, they would be violently driven out by angry mobs. At the time, many believers accepted these prophecies without question, but as the church struggled and these grand promises failed to materialize, cracks began forming within Joseph's inner circle. The first major challenge to his authority was coming, and it would strike at the very foundation of the church. By 1837, the church faced a massive financial disaster, one that would shake Joseph's credibility and drive many of his closest followers away. As the church expanded, so did its financial needs. Land purchases, temple construction, and missionary work required money the saints simply didn't have. In response, Joseph helped create the Kirtland Safety Society, a financial institution meant to function like a private bank. The plan was simple. The church would issue its own currency, backed by land and church assets, and members could invest in it to help build the kingdom of God. But there was one major problem. Joseph and his associates lacked a banking license. When they applied for one in Ohio, the state denied their request. Instead of shutting down, they went ahead anyway, operating the bank illegally. And then, disaster struck. In 1837, a nationwide financial panic hit, causing banks across the country to fail. The Kirtland Safety Society collapsed, and church members who had invested their savings suddenly found themselves penniless. Many who had once seen Joseph as a prophet now saw him as a reckless leader, or worse, a fraud. The fallout was immediate. A wave of disillusionment spread through the church, and one by one, some of Joseph's closest allies turned against him. For the first time, Joseph's leadership was openly challenged. Oliver Cowdery, who had once been Joseph's most trusted companion, began questioning his handling of church finances and privately his relationships with other women. David Whitmer, another early leader, lost faith in Joseph's prophecies and believed he had become too focused on power. Even Martin Harris, the man who had mortgaged his farm to print the Book of Mormon, distanced himself from the church. For years, these men had followed Joseph without question. But now, they saw him differently. The failed bank, the unfulfilled prophecies, and the secret doctrines he was teaching in the Kirtland Temple were too much for them. As tensions escalated, some members of the church even tried to remove Joseph from leadership. Threats were made, lawsuits were filed, and soon it was no longer safe for him to remain in Kirtland. Joseph had no choice. He had to leave. Joseph Smith had fled Kirtland in disgrace, but he still had hope. In Missouri, the saints had already begun settling, believing it to be the land of Zion, the place where they would build their new Jerusalem. But when Joseph arrived in far west Missouri, he found that his people were already at war. Tensions between the Mormons and their neighbors had reached a breaking point, and what had started as small disputes over land and politics had escalated into open violence. As conflict erupted across the state, Missouri's governor would take extreme action, issuing an order to have every Mormon in the state exterminated or driven out. For the first time, Joseph Smith was not just fighting for his church, he was fighting for his survival. Missouri had been a promised land since 1831, when Joseph declared that independence would be the center of Zion. But after the saints were violently expelled from Jackson County in 1833,
They had been forced to move north, settling in far west Caldwell County, a place designated specifically for Mormons by the state government. At first, things were peaceful. The saints were growing in numbers, and Joseph arrived in 1838 to re-establish his leadership. But from the moment he stepped into Missouri, it was clear that something had changed. The conflict between the saints and their neighbors was worse than ever. Missourians were deeply suspicious of the Mormon settlers, who arrived in large groups, voted as a bloc, and openly preached that Missouri had been promised to them by God. Many locals feared that the Mormons would take over politically and economically.
In mid-1838, as violence intensified, a secretive Mormon paramilitary group known as the Danites emerged in Missouri. The Danites were a vigilante force made up of Mormon men who swore loyalty to Joseph Smith. Their mission was simple: defend the church at all costs. But their methods were anything but peaceful. Under the leadership of Samson Avad, the Danites began organizing raids against anti-Mormon mobs. They stole livestock, burned homes, and drove out anyone they saw as a threat to the saints. For the first time, the Mormons were not just defending themselves, they were retaliating. And Joseph, though never directly linked to their actions, did not condemn them. He saw their actions as justified, a necessary means of securing Zion. It was during this time that Joseph received another important revelation. God instructed him to rename the church again, this time calling it the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Returning Christ's name to the church reinforced the idea that God was in charge and that Joseph was the leader of the one true church.
On August 6, 1838, the conflict finally exploded into full-scale war. That day in Gallatin, Missouri, Mormon settlers attempted to vote in the local elections. But their presence was met with fury from local Missourians, who feared that the growing Mormon vote would shift the balance of power. A fight broke out. Fists turned to clubs. Clubs turned to gunfire. The battle ended with several wounded, and the Mormons effectively shut out of the election. After Gallatin, the violence escalated. Mormon and Missourian militias began launching attacks on each other. Towns were raided, homes were burned, and both sides believed they were fighting a war for survival. The bloodiest moment of the war came on October 30th, 1838, at Horns Mill, a small Mormon settlement. Days earlier, Missouri's governor, Lilburn Boggs, had issued an order that would change history, the Mormon Extermination Order. Boggs declared that the Mormons were in open rebellion and must be exterminated or driven from the state. With that order in place, Missouri militias acted quickly. That afternoon, a mob of around 200 armed men attacked Horns Mill. Women and children ran for cover. Unarmed men were shot in cold blood. Some of the survivors took refuge in a nearby blacksmith shop, but the attackers fired through the walls, killing nearly every man inside. When the smoke cleared, 17 Mormons lay dead. Among them were young children, some executed at point-blank range. It was a massacre. And for the saints, it was a defining moment of persecution. Joseph Smith was in chains. After the Mormon War in Missouri, he and several other church leaders had been captured and charged with treason. The saints had been violently expelled from the state under Governor Boggs's extermination order, leaving them scattered and homeless. Joseph sat in Liberty Jail for months, awaiting trial. Conditions were harsh. The prison was cold, food was scarce, and morale was low. But even in captivity, Joseph continued leading the church, dictating letters to his followers and declaring that their suffering was part of God's plan. Then, in April 1839, an opportunity came. As Joseph and his fellow prisoners were being transferred to another location, their guards allowed them to escape, either due to bribery, sympathy, or simply a lack of will to keep them locked up. Joseph fled across the Mississippi River into Illinois, where thousands of displaced saints had already begun regrouping. He had lost Missouri, but now he had a new vision.
The saints needed a home, and Joseph would build them a city unlike any before. A city where they would no longer be outcasts. A city where they would gather for the last days. He called it Nauvoo. The land that would become Nauvoo was nothing more than a swamp, a disease-ridden, mosquito-infested stretch of land on the banks of the Mississippi River. But the saints had no other choice. They drained the swamps, built homes, and in just a few years, Nauvoo became one of the largest cities in Illinois. Joseph personally oversaw its development, ensuring that the saints would never be vulnerable again. But to truly secure their future, they needed political power. In 1840, Joseph successfully lobbied the Illinois state legislature to grant the Nauvoo Charter, a legal document that gave the city unprecedented autonomy. Under the charter, Nauvoo had its own government, its own courts, and most significantly, its own military force, the Nauvoo Legion. This wasn't just a local militia, it was a heavily armed force, rivaling the size of the entire Illinois State Army. And at its head was Joseph Smith. For the first time, Joseph was not just a prophet. He was a political and military leader, the ruler of a growing kingdom. As Nauvoo grew into a thriving city, Joseph Smith's teachings were rapidly evolving. He was no longer just a prophet restoring ancient truths. He was creating entirely new doctrines, new rituals, and a new vision of God's kingdom. And in 1842, he introduced one of his most controversial teachings yet: Masonic rituals adapted into a new temple ceremony. On March 15th, 1842, Joseph Smith was initiated into the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge. Freemasonry was a fraternal organization with deep ties to American politics, secret rituals, and symbolic teachings. Many of Nauvoo's most powerful men, including Hiram Smith, Brigham Young, and Heber C. Kimball, were already Masons. Joseph quickly rose through the ranks. The very next day, on March 16, 1842, he was raised to the highest degree of Master Mason. For many, this was a surprise. Freemasonry was not a religion, but its rituals and teachings focused on mystical enlightenment, secret handshakes, and symbols of divine power. But to Joseph, Freemasonry was more than just a brotherhood. It was a remnant of ancient priesthood ceremonies, proof that secret knowledge had been preserved from the time of Solomon's temple. And just weeks after his initiation, he introduced a new temple ceremony, one that bore striking similarities to Masonic rituals. On May 4, 1842, Joseph gathered 9 of his most trusted followers in the upper room of his red brick store in Nauvoo. There, he introduced a new endowment, a sacred ceremony that would prepare saints for the afterlife. The original Kirtland temple ceremonies had been simple, focused on washings, anointings, and speaking in tongues. But the Nauvoo endowment was different. It included symbols, signs, oaths, and handshakes, rituals that closely mirrored Freemasonry. Participants were required to take covenants of secrecy, promising never to reveal what happened inside the temple. For Joseph, the endowment was not just another ritual. It was the highest level of priesthood power. He taught that those who received it were prepared to become gods themselves. Even before the endowment was introduced, Joseph had already received a revelation commanding the saints to build a new temple in Nauvoo. The Nauvoo temple would be unlike anything the saints had built before. A grand structure with spires reaching toward heaven, a house of the Lord where sacred ordinances would be performed. Construction began in 1841, and the saints poured their time, money, and labor into the project. In the spring of 1843, in the small town of Kinderhook, Illinois, a man named Robert Wiley claimed to be guided by a dream, 3 nights in a row, urging him to dig into a nearby mound. With the help of others, he excavated the earth and uncovered skeletal remains buried deep beneath the surface. Clutched to the chest of the skeleton were 6 brass plates, bell-shaped and etched with strange, unfamiliar symbols. the plates caused a stir. Among the diggers was a member of the Latter-day Saints, and the discovery was quickly relayed to Joseph Smith in Nauvoo. The plates were brought before him, and his scribe William Clayton recorded what happened next. President Joseph has translated a portion and says they contain the history of the person with whom they were found. He was a descendant of Ham, through the loins of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and that he received his kingdom from the ruler of heaven and earth. The Times and Seasons published a glowing editorial, expressing hope that the plates would undoubtedly confirm the truth of the Book of Mormon. A follow-up publication in the Nauvoo Neighbor even featured facsimiles of all 12 sides of the plates, promising a full translation would be forthcoming. But that translation never came. Joseph Smith was killed the following year, leaving the mystery of the Kinderhook Plates unresolved. For nearly 140 years, the plates were cited by church leaders and historians as further evidence of his divine calling. Then, in 1980, one of the original plates, held by the Chicago Historical Society, was subjected to scientific testing. The results were clear. The plate was made with 19th century brass and etched with acid, not engraved with ancient tools. It was, as one of the creators had confessed decades earlier, a deliberate hoax, designed to test whether the prophet would attempt to translate a modern forgery. He had. And with that, another chapter was added to the complex legacy of Joseph Smith. By 1841, Joseph Smith was no longer just preaching plural marriage in secret. He was living it. He had introduced the practice quietly, marrying his first Nauvoo plural wife, Louisa Beeman, in 1841. But over the next 3 years, he would take dozens more wives, creating a network of secret unions that reached into the highest levels of church leadership. Some of these marriages were consensual and deeply devoted. Others were marked by secrecy, coercion, and betrayal. And as Joseph expanded the practice, it became more controversial than anything he had ever introduced. Helen Mar Kimball was the daughter of Heber C. Kimball, one of Joseph's most loyal apostles. In 1843, when she was just 14 years old, Joseph approached her father with a proposal. Helen should be sealed to him as a plural wife. According to Helen's later accounts, Joseph and her father told her that if she accepted the marriage, her family would be guaranteed eternal salvation. They promised her that this was a divine commandment and that her youth did not matter in the eternal scheme of things. Feeling pressured, Helen agreed. Years later, she would write that at the time, she had no idea what plural marriage truly meant. She had been raised to trust the prophet, and when he said the arrangement was necessary for salvation, how could she refuse? While some of Joseph's plural marriages were to single women, others were to women already married to faithful Mormon men. At least 11 of Joseph's plural wives were already married to other men at the time of their sealing, a practice known as polyandry. Among these women were Marinda Nancy Johnson Hyde, wife of Apostle Orson Hyde. While Orson was away on a mission to Jerusalem, Joseph secretly married Marinda in 1842. Another was Zena Diantha Huntington Jacobs. She was married to Henry Jacobs, a devoted Mormon, when Joseph took her as a plural wife in 1841. Henry remained unaware of the union for some time and continued treating Zena as his legal wife. To Joseph, these sealings were not about adultery, but about eternal priesthood authority. He taught that some marriages were not valid in God's eyes, and that a woman could be sealed to a higher priesthood holder for exaltation in the afterlife. But to many, this doctrine was deeply unsettling. Joseph's plural marriages often followed a distinct pattern. He frequently married multiple women from the same family. At least 5 sets of sisters were sealed to him, including Emily and Eliza Partridge, Sarah and Maria Lawrence, and Lucy and Sarah Kimball. Even more controversial were mother-daughter pairs. For example, Joseph married both Patty Bartlett Sessions and her daughter Sylvia Sessions Lyon. This pattern was not common among other Mormon polygamists, and suggests that Joseph might have considered certain bloodlines as having special spiritual significance.
As more people learned of plural marriage, many questioned why Joseph would introduce such a controversial doctrine. His answer was clear: he had no choice. According to later accounts, Joseph claimed that an angel had appeared to him 3 times between 1834 and 1842, commanding him to practice polygamy. The 3rd time, the angel came with a drawn sword, warning that if Joseph did not establish plural marriage, he would be destroyed. For Joseph, he tried to reassure the saints that this was not a personal desire, it was a divine commandment. But for many, it was a sign that Joseph might be becoming a fallen prophet. Not every woman accepted Joseph's proposals. Some, despite the pressure, refused. Nancy Rigdon, daughter of Sidney Rigdon, was one of them. When Joseph proposed a secret marriage to her in 1842, she was horrified. She immediately rejected him and told her family. In response, Joseph wrote her a letter, now known as the Happiness Letter. In it, he justified plural marriage, arguing that true happiness comes from obeying God, even when the commandment is difficult. Nancy was unconvinced, and her refusal would become one of the many cracks forming in Joseph's inner circle. Joseph knew that polygamy could tear his marriage apart. For months, he had hidden the extent of his plural marriages from Emma, but in 1843, the time for secrecy ended. He recorded the revelation now known as Doctrine and Covenants 132, which formally declared plural marriage as God's law. But Joseph did not deliver this revelation to Emma himself. Instead, he sent his brother Hiram to read it to her. Emma's reaction was exactly as Joseph had feared. She was furious. She refused to accept polygamy, and their marriage descended into constant conflict. At times, she seemed to tolerate it. At others, she actively tried to destroy it. Emma's resistance was one of the greatest challenges Joseph ever faced. And as more people learned of polygamy, the number of enemies within Nauvoo was growing. In 1844, Joseph Smith took his most radical step yet. He formed a secret political organization known as the Council of 50. But this was no ordinary church council. Behind closed doors, Joseph and his closest followers envisioned something far greater, a theocratic government tasked with establishing the kingdom of God on earth. To Joseph, the US government was corrupt and collapsing. Only divine law, administered through God's chosen prophet, could save the world. The council debated bold plans, moving the saints to Texas, Oregon, or California to found an independent nation, a Zion beyond the reach of American law. And then, in one of the most extraordinary moments of his life, Joseph was secretly anointed by the council as king, priest, and ruler over Israel on earth. This quiet coronation, performed in a private ceremony, was known only to his inner circle. It was a symbolic kingship, a declaration that God's political kingdom had begun, with Joseph at its head. For nearly 170 years, this secret remained buried in handwritten records. But in 2016, the minutes of the Council of 50 were finally published by the Joseph Smith Papers Project, revealing for the first time to the public that Joseph had been crowned king over God's earthly kingdom. To outsiders in 1844, the rumors were alarming enough. The idea of a religious leader with his own army, his own government, and now whispers of monarchy struck terror into Illinois politicians. To them, Joseph Smith wasn't just a church leader anymore, he was a revolutionary, and Joseph was about to push them even further. By mid-1844, dissent was rising inside Nauvoo. Some of Joseph's closest allies had turned against him. William Law, who served Joseph as a member of the first presidency of the church, along with Wilson Law and Robert Foster, who were also high-ranking church leaders, were now his greatest enemies. They were outraged by his secret marriages, his growing political power, and his control over Nauvoo. They accused him of abusing his authority and misleading the saints. In June 1844, they published a newspaper, the Nauvoo Expositor, exposing Joseph's polygamy and denouncing his leadership. Joseph saw the paper as a direct attack on his power.
Acting as Nauvoo's mayor, he ordered the destruction of the press. The Nauvoo Legion carried out the order, smashing the press and burning every copy of the paper. But this was a fatal mistake. The destruction of the press was seen as an attack on free speech and the Constitution of the United States. This was why Illinois saw it as a legal justification to arrest him. They weren't just targeting him for polygamy, but for attacking press freedom.
As the situation worsened, Joseph gathered his closest advisors and made a decision. He would flee Nauvoo. Late at night on June 22nd, 1844, he and a small group of followers crossed the Mississippi River into Iowa, planning to continue westward. He hoped to regroup and possibly lead the Saints to a new settlement beyond the borders of the United States. But as he waited on the Iowa side of the river, messengers arrived from Nauvoo. Emma and other leaders begged Joseph to return. They feared that if he ran, the people of Nauvoo would suffer. They warned that the governor might see his escape as a sign of guilt, giving the militia an excuse to attack the city. Joseph thought for a long moment. Then he said a single sentence. "If my life is of no value to my friends, it is of none to myself." And with that, he turned back. The next morning, Joseph Smith rode into Nauvoo for the last time. He gathered his closest followers and delivered his final instructions. To his brother Hiram, he said, "I am going like a lamb to the slaughter, but I am calm as a summer's morning. I have a conscience void of offense toward God and toward all men." To his followers, he said, "I shall die innocent, and it shall yet be said of me, he was murdered in cold blood." With those final words, Joseph and Hiram surrendered. They were taken under guard to Carthage jail, where a mob was already waiting for them. For 2 days, Joseph Smith sat in Carthage jail, awaiting trial for inciting a riot. But he knew he would not leave alive. On the afternoon of June 27th, 1844, a mob of over 100 men, their faces blackened with gunpowder, stormed the jail. Joseph, Hiram, and their companions tried to hold the door, but the mob burst through with gunfire. Hiram was the first to fall. A bullet shattered his face, and as he collapsed, he gasped, "I am a dead man." Joseph realized escape was impossible. In desperation, he drew a small pistol that had been smuggled to him and fired into the mob, wounding a few but killing no one. Then he turned, ran to the window and attempted to flee. What happened next is both dramatic and shrouded in mystery and controversy. According to some later accounts, as Joseph approached the window, he may have raised his arm in a gesture, one that some believe resembled a Masonic distress sign, a final plea for mercy, a subconscious call for brotherhood, or simply a myth built in the aftermath. Eyewitnesses make no mention of it, but the story has persisted. Just before he could leap, a bullet struck him in the back. He fell forward, tumbling from the second-story window to the ground below. As he lay dying in the dirt, a member of the mob approached and fired one final shot, point blank. Joseph Smith was dead. The prophet of the Latter-day Saints was gone. Joseph's death sent shockwaves through the church. For years, he had held absolute authority. But now the saints faced a new crisis. Who would lead them? Some believed the church should pass to Joseph's family. Others turned to Brigham Young and the quorum of the 12 apostles. The church was about to split. And for those who remained faithful, one question remained: where would they go next? In the days after Joseph's murder, chaos and uncertainty gripped Nauvoo. With no clear successor, multiple men stepped forward, each claiming the right to lead. Sidney Rigdon, the last surviving member of the First Presidency, declared himself the rightful guardian of the church. Others, including Martin Harris, followed James Strang, a convert who claimed that Joseph had appointed him through a handwritten letter.
And then there was Brigham Young. As leader of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, Young had no claim to prophetic succession, but he had the loyalty of the saints. In the end, the majority followed Brigham. Rigdon was excommunicated. Strang broke away, forming his own group. Joseph's family refused to follow Brigham. Years later, his son, Joseph Smith III, would form what became the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Joseph's enemies weren't finished. By 1845, mobs began attacking Mormon settlements. Houses were burned, businesses destroyed, and violence escalated. The Illinois government made its position clear. The Mormons had to go. In the winter of 1846, the first wagons rolled out of Nauvoo. Thousands of saints, led by Brigham Young, abandoned their city and began a long, treacherous journey into the unknown. They had lost Kirtland. They had lost Missouri. And now they were leaving Nauvoo, the city Joseph built. But where Joseph's dream had died, a new one was about to begin. In life, Joseph Smith had been a visionary, a prophet, a leader, and to his enemies, a fraud and a tyrant. He had claimed to restore ancient priesthoods, translated sacred texts, introduced polygamy, and built cities from nothing. He had made bold prophecies, some that inspired and others that failed. He had been loved, hated, worshipped, and feared. And in death he became something even greater, a martyr. Millions of people around the world still follow Joseph's teachings, his revelations, and his vision. His influence endures, not just in religion, but in American history itself. But the story of Joseph Smith is not just about one man. It is the story of faith and power, of belief and betrayal, of a movement that changed American history. But history is never just about the past. It's about how we interpret it today. What do you think? Was Joseph Smith a true prophet, a brilliant leader, or a man caught in his own ambitions? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you found this documentary engaging, don't forget to give this video a like and consider subscribing and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest historical deep dives. There are many more stories to uncover, and history is always more complex than it seems. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in our next video. Joseph had been crowned king over God's... Wait, why is there a dead guy on the floor? This revelation, now known as Doctrine and Covenants 88, commanded the... No, that's not right. Doctrine and Covenants. What the How is that wagon balancing on two wheels? I have no words. As he lay dying in the dirt, a member of the mob... Wait, why does that guy have 3 arms? There's a magical golden box flying in the air while we are on fire. Why is Leonardo AI so retarded? God instructed him to rename the church again, this time calling it the Church Christ of Latter-day Saints. Oh my God. I meant the Church of Jesus Christ Day-to-Day Studdites. I do not like the cone of shame. Sometimes people literally lost their heads when Joseph Smith proposed plural marriage. The real first vision was when Jesus healed Joseph's knees. What in the world? Hey look, a stretched limousine horse. Joseph would place his peepstone in a hat. Wait, let me check. I don't think it levitated like that. But he was into weird magic, so I don't know. Ah yes, the stuff nightmares are made of. Bruh, I don't think it works like that. And Joseph turned to his brother and said, "Hey!" I'm not an expert, but I don't think that engine model was made in America in the 1840s. And is that guy meditating on the water? St. Peter must be jealous. To his brother Hiram, he said, "I am going to have a lamb in my trousers. Wait, sorry. Like a lamb to the slaughter, but I'm as calm as a summer's morning."